in the opulent drawing rooms of New York's Fifth Avenue, where gaslight flickered against silk wallpaper and fortunes were made with handshakes. Evangeline Ashworth had always believed that love would find her naturally. The year was 1885, and the Gilded Age demanded perfection from its daughters, beauty, grace, and most importantly, advantageous marriages. But on a rain-soaked October morning, as wedding bells echoed through St. Thomas Church, Evangeline discovered that even the most carefully laid plans could crumble in an instant. What she didn't know was that her greatest humiliation would become the key to her most extraordinary triumph. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Ashworth mansion on East 73rd Street, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had been imported at considerable expense from the finest merchants in the city. Evangeline Ashworth stood before her vanity mirror, her lady's maid carefully arranging the final touches of her elaborate coiffure. At 22, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that graced the society pages: auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, intelligent green eyes, and a graceful bearing that spoke of years of deportment lessons. "Miss Evangeline, you look absolutely radiant," murmured her maid, stepping back to admire her handiwork. The pale blue morning dress, with its intricate beadwork and perfectly fitted bodice, had been crafted by Worth himself during the family's last trip to Paris. Evangeline smiled politely, though her reflection revealed a hint of melancholy that no amount of powder could conceal. In 3 days she would walk down the aisle of St. Thomas Church to marry Duke Reginald Pemberton, the second son of an English earl who had come to America seeking both fortune and a suitable wife. The arrangement had been orchestrated by her father, railroad magnate Harrison Ashworth, who saw the union as the perfect culmination of his family's rise to prominence. "The Duke is quite handsome," her younger sister Cordelia had remarked just yesterday, her blue eyes sparkling with what Evangeline had assumed was sisterly excitement. At 19, Cordelia possessed a more vivacious beauty, golden curls, porcelain skin, and a laugh that seemed to enchant everyone who heard it. Where Evangeline was thoughtful and reserved, Cordelia was spontaneous and charming, the kind of girl who could command a ballroom simply by entering it. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago at a lavish party in the Ashworth ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across the assembled guests. Duke Pemberton had been the picture of aristocratic refinement, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that came from centuries of noble breeding. He had kissed Evangeline's gloved hand with practiced gallantry and spoken of their future with the measured tones of a man accustomed to having his desires fulfilled. "You shall be the perfect duchess," he had told her that evening, his gray eyes appraising her as one might evaluate a prized thoroughbred. "Your father has assured me of your accomplishments. You speak French fluently, play the piano beautifully, and have been educated in all the social graces. We shall make a formidable team in London society." Evangeline had nodded graciously, though something in his tone had made her feel more like a business acquisition than a beloved bride to be. Still, she had been raised to understand that marriage among their class was as much about alliance as affection, and she had convinced herself that love would grow naturally from mutual respect and shared goals. The Duke had spent the past months dividing his time between the Ashworth household and his temporary residence at the Plaza Hotel, where he entertained other wealthy Americans seeking to purchase European titles for their daughters. He was charming at dinner parties, knowledgeable about art and literature, and possessed the kind of worldly sophistication that impressed her parents' circle. Yet Evangeline often found herself wondering what thoughts lay behind his perfectly composed exterior. "He seems rather fond of Cordelia's company," her friend Margaret Whitmore had observed during a recent tea party, her voice carefully neutral. They were deep in conversation at the Vanderbilt soiree last week. Evangeline had dismissed the comment with a laugh. "Cordelia has that effect on everyone. She could charm a statue into conversation." But privately she had begun to notice the way the Duke's eyes followed her sister across crowded rooms, and how his formal demeanor seemed to soften whenever Cordelia spoke. Now, as she prepared for another day of wedding preparations, final fittings, menu tastings, and endless consultations with the florist, Evangeline tried to push aside her growing unease. Perhaps it was merely pre-wedding nerves, the natural anxiety that came with such a momentous life change. After all, she would soon be leaving everything familiar behind to start a new life in England, far from her family and friends. The sound of laughter drifted up from the garden below, and Evangeline moved to the window to see Cordelia and the Duke strolling among the late-blooming roses. Her sister's golden head was tilted toward him in animated conversation, and even from this distance Evangeline could see the genuine smile that transformed his usually reserved features. They looked, she realized with a sharp pang, like two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and her mother, Mrs. Harrison Ashworth, swept into the room in a rustle of burgundy silk. Eleanor Ashworth was a formidable woman who had successfully navigated her family's rise from comfortable middle class to the very pinnacle of New York society. and she approached her daughter's wedding with the strategic precision of a military campaign. "Evangeline, darling, we must review the seating arrangements one final time," she announced, spreading an elaborate chart across the bed. "The Duke's cousin, Lord Pemberton, has just confirmed his attendance, and we must ensure he's placed appropriately. This wedding will be the social event of the season, and every detail must be perfect." As her mother launched into a detailed discussion of precedence and protocol, Evangeline found her attention wandering back to the garden, where Cordelia and the Duke had disappeared from view. Something cold and heavy settled in her stomach, a premonition she couldn't quite name. In just 3 days she would promise to love, honor, and obey a man who seemed increasingly like a stranger, while her sister's laughter echoed in her memory like a warning bell. What Evangeline didn't know was that downstairs, in the privacy of her father's study, a conversation was taking place that would shatter her carefully ordered world and change the course of her life forever. The morning of October 15, 1885, dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the stained-glass windows of St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue. The Gothic Revival sanctuary had been transformed into a floral paradise. White roses, orange blossoms, and trailing ivy adorned every pew, while the altar blazed with hundreds of candles that cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled congregation. Evangeline sat in the bridal chamber adjacent to the church, her wedding gown spread around her like a cloud of ivory silk and Brussels lace. The dress had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to complete, with seed pearls hand-sewn into intricate patterns that caught the light with every breath. Her veil, a family heirloom that had belonged to her grandmother, cascaded in delicate folds from a diamond tiara that had been her father's wedding gift. "You look like a princess from a fairy tale," whispered her cousin Amelia, who served as one of her bridesmaids. The other attendants, Margaret Whitmore, Priscilla Vanderburg, and her sister Cordelia, bustled around her, adjusting her train and ensuring every detail was perfect. Evangeline noticed that Cordelia seemed unusually quiet, her usual vivacious chatter replaced by an almost nervous energy. Her sister's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the orange blossoms in Evangeline's bouquet, and she avoided meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Are you feeling well, Cordelia?" Evangeline asked gently. "You seem rather pale, just excited for your big day," Cordelia replied quickly, her voice higher than usual. "I can hardly believe my sister's about to become a duchess." Through the chamber's window, Evangeline could see the steady stream of carriages arriving at the church. All of New York society had turned out for the wedding: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, and dozens of other prominent families whose presence would cement the Ashworth family's position at the very apex of American high society. She spotted her father's business associates, political figures, and even a correspondent from the society pages of the New York Herald. A soft knock announced the arrival of her father, resplendent in his morning coat and silk top hat. Harrison Ashworth was a self-made man who had built his railroad empire through shrewd business dealings and an iron will. But as he looked at his eldest daughter, his weathered face softened with genuine emotion. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with pride, "you look absolutely magnificent. The Duke is a fortunate man indeed." Evangeline rose carefully, mindful of her elaborate train, and took her father's offered arm. As they made their way toward the church's main entrance, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the packed sanctuary, punctuated by the soft strains of the organ playing Bach's Jesu. Joy of man's desiring, the massive oak doors swung open, and Evangeline felt her breath catch as she took in the scene before her. Nearly 400 guests rose to their feet, their faces turned toward her with expressions of admiration and anticipation. The church was a sea of elegant morning dress and elaborate hats, with jewels glittering in the candlelight like stars against the rich fabrics. At the altar, Duke Reginald Pemberton stood waiting in his formal morning coat, his dark hair perfectly groomed and his posture ramrod straight. Beside him, his best man, his cousin Lord Pemberton, cut an equally impressive figure. The Duke's face was composed, almost mask-like in its perfection, but Evangeline thought she detected something strange in his expression, a tension that hadn't been there during their rehearsal the previous evening. The organ swelled into the triumphant notes of Wagner's bridal chorus, and Evangeline began her slow procession down the aisle. Each step felt weighted with significance, carrying her toward a future that had been planned and orchestrated down to the smallest detail. She smiled graciously at familiar faces in the congregation, her mother's bridge partners, her father's business associates. The young men who had once courted her before the Duke's arrival had ended all other romantic possibilities. Halfway down the aisle, she noticed a commotion near the front of the church. The Duke had turned to speak urgently with his cousin, their heads bent together in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Several guests in the front pews were beginning to whisper among themselves, their fans fluttering with nervous energy. As Evangeline drew closer to the altar, she could see that the Duke's composed facade was beginning to crack. His face had gone pale, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the cool October air. When their eyes met, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not love, not even affection, but what looked unmistakably like panic. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Dr. Morgan, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God in this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Evangeline, but she found herself increasingly focused on the Duke's strange behavior. His hands were clenched at his sides, and he kept glancing toward the congregation as if searching for someone. When the Reverend asked if anyone knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, the silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. "If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together," Dr. Morgan continued, "let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." It was then that Duke Pemberton did the unthinkable. Instead of remaining silent, he stepped forward and raised his hand. "I must speak," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned sanctuary. A collective gasp rose from the congregation, and Evangeline felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Your Grace?" Dr. Morgan asked, his face a picture of confusion and concern. The Duke turned to face the congregation, his gray eyes seeking and finding Cordelia among the bridesmaids. "I cannot in good conscience proceed with this ceremony," he announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My heart belongs to another, and it would be a grave injustice to Miss Ashworth to enter into a marriage built on deception." The church erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Evangeline stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she watched her carefully constructed future crumble before her eyes. She followed the Duke's gaze to her sister, who had gone white as her bridesmaid's dress, tears streaming down her face. "I am deeply in love with Miss Cordelia Ashworth," the Duke continued, his declaration ringing through the sanctuary like a death knell. "We have tried to fight our feelings out of respect for the existing engagement, but love cannot be denied. I humbly ask for her hand in marriage instead." The silence that followed was deafening. Evangeline felt as though she were drowning, the elaborate church spinning around her as the magnitude of her humiliation crashed over her in waves. 400 of New York's most prominent citizens had just witnessed her public rejection, her sister's betrayal, and the complete destruction of her reputation. Her father's face had turned purple with rage, while her mother sat rigid in the front pew, her fan snapping shut with an audible crack. But it was Cordelia's expression that cut deepest, not shame or regret, but relief, as if a terrible burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Cordelia?" the Duke called softly, extending his hand toward her. "Will you have me?" Through her tears, Cordelia nodded, stepping forward to take his offered hand. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the Duke lifted her fingers to his lips, sealing their betrayal with a tender kiss. Evangeline's bouquet slipped from her nerveless fingers, orange blossoms scattering across the marble floor like fallen tears. The fairy tale wedding had become a nightmare, and she was trapped at its center, exposed and humiliated before everyone who mattered in her world. What happened next would determine not just her immediate future, but the very course of her life. And Evangeline Ashworth was about to discover reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. The carriage ride back to the Ashworth mansion passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels against cobblestones and her mother's barely suppressed sobs. Evangeline sat rigidly upright, still wearing her wedding gown, the elaborate bustle crushed against the velvet seat. Her father's jaw was set in a hard line, his knuckles white as he gripped his walking stick, while the ruins of their social triumph lay scattered behind them like the orange blossoms on the church floor. The mansion on East 73rd Street, which had buzzed with celebratory preparations just hours before, now felt like a mausoleum. Servants scurried about with downcast eyes, hastily removing wedding decorations and packing away the elaborate reception that would never be. The 5-tiered cake, a masterpiece of spun sugar and French pastry, sat abandoned in the dining room like a monument to shattered dreams. Evangeline retreated to her bedroom, where her lady's maid helped her out of the wedding gown with trembling hands. Each pearl button that was unfastened felt like another link in the chain of her humiliation being broken, until she stood in only her chemise and corset, feeling more exposed than if she had been completely naked. "Shall I pack your things, miss?" the maid asked hesitantly. "Your father mentioned something about a change of residence." Before Evangeline could respond, her mother burst through the door, her face blotchy with tears and rage. "How could she do this to us?" Eleanor Ashworth wailed, collapsing into the velvet armchair by the window. "How could Cordelia betray her own sister so completely? And that fortune-hunting scoundrel to humiliate us in front of all of New York society?" The next 3 days passed in a blur of whispered conversations, hastily canceled social engagements, and the steady stream of calling cards left by curious society matrons who claimed to offer sympathy but clearly sought gossip. The newspapers had seized upon the scandal with gleeful abandon. Duke jilts heiress for sister at altar screamed the headline of the New York Herald, while the society pages dissected every detail of the failed wedding with surgical precision. Cordelia had departed for the Plaza Hotel with the Duke immediately after the ceremony, leaving behind only a tear-stained letter of apology that did little to explain her betrayal. "I never meant for this to happen," she had written in her familiar flowing script. "But when love strikes like lightning, one cannot control where it lands. Please forgive me, dearest sister. I pray that someday you will understand." It was Harrison Ashworth who finally provided the escape Evangeline desperately needed. On the fourth morning after the disaster, he knocked softly on her bedroom door, his usual commanding presence tempered by genuine concern for his eldest daughter. "My dear," he said gently, settling into the chair beside her bed, "I've been corresponding with your great-aunt Agatha in Boston. She's invited you to stay with her for as long as you need. A change of scenery might be exactly what you require." Evangeline had met Agatha Pembroke only a handful of times, but she remembered her as a formidable woman in her 60s who had scandalized Boston society by refusing to marry and instead dedicating her life to various intellectual pursuits. She lived in a grand townhouse on Beacon Hill, surrounded by books, art, and a rotating cast of writers, philosophers, and social reformers who found her salon both stimulating and slightly dangerous. "Aunt Agatha has always marched to the beat of her own drum," her father continued with a slight smile. "She never married, you know, despite having numerous suitors. Said she preferred her independence to any man's protection. Perhaps she can offer you some perspective on recent events." 2 weeks later, Evangeline found herself standing on the front steps of the Pembroke townhouse, her trunks being unloaded by efficient servants while autumn leaves swirled around her feet. The 4-story brick building exuded an air of quiet elegance, with its bow-front windows and wrought-iron balconies overlooking the common. It was a far cry from the ostentatious grandeur of Fifth Avenue, but there was something deeply appealing about its understated sophistication. Agatha Pembroke herself answered the door, and Evangeline was struck by how little her great-aunt had changed. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon. Her violet eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her own worth. "Evangeline, my dear child," Agatha said warmly, embracing her with surprising strength. "Welcome to my little sanctuary. I trust the journey from New York wasn't too taxing." The interior of the townhouse was a revelation. Instead of the heavy, dark furnishings that dominated most fashionable homes, Agatha had filled her rooms with light and color. Impressionist paintings hung alongside classical sculptures, while floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained volumes in multiple languages. Fresh flowers brightened every room, and the overall effect was one of cultured refinement without pretension. "I've prepared the blue bedroom for you," Agatha continued, leading Evangeline up the curved staircase. "It has lovely morning light and overlooks the garden. I thought you might appreciate the privacy while you adjust to your new circumstances." That evening, as they dined by candlelight in the intimate dining room, Agatha proved to be exactly the companion Evangeline needed. She didn't offer empty platitudes or false sympathy, but instead engaged her great niece in stimulating conversation about literature, art, and current events. "I've been following the women's suffrage movement with great interest," Agatha mentioned over the fish course. "There's a remarkable young woman named Dr. Sarah Mackenzie who's been giving lectures about women's education and professional opportunities. She's quite revolutionary in her thinking, believes that women are capable of far more than society currently allows." Evangeline found herself genuinely intrigued. "A female doctor? How extraordinary. I imagine she faces considerable opposition." "Indeed she does," Agatha replied with a knowing smile. "But she persists nonetheless. In fact, she's speaking at the Boston Women's Literary Society next week. Perhaps you'd like to attend? It might be illuminating." The following week, Evangeline found herself in the elegant parlor of the Women's Literary Society. Surrounded by an eclectic group of Boston's most progressive women, Dr. Sarah Mackenzie proved to be a revelation. A woman in her early 30s with intelligent brown eyes and an air of quiet authority that commanded immediate respect. "Education," Dr. Mackenzie declared to the assembled group, "is the key to women's liberation. When we expand our minds, we expand our possibilities. We need not be confined to the roles that society has predetermined for us," as the doctor spoke about her work at the Boston Women's Medical College and her efforts to establish a clinic for working-class women. Evangeline felt something stirring within her, a sense of possibility she had never experienced before. Here was a woman who had chosen her own path, who had refused to be limited by convention or expectation. After the lecture, Agatha introduced Evangeline to several members of the society, including Dr. Mackenzie herself. But it was another introduction that would prove most significant to Dr. Elias Reed, a young physician who had been quietly observing from the back of the room. Dr. Reed was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair, thoughtful gray eyes, and the kind of understated handsomeness that grew more appealing upon closer acquaintance. Unlike the Duke's polished, aristocratic bearing, there was something genuine and unpretentious about him that immediately put Evangeline at ease. "Miss Ashworth," he said when Agatha performed the introduction, "I understand you're visiting from New York. How are you finding Boston?" "Quite enlightening," Evangeline replied honestly. "I'm discovering that there are many more possibilities for women than I had previously imagined, Doctor." Reed smiled, and she noticed how it transformed his entire face. "Dr. Mackenzie has that effect on people. She's been instrumental in changing many minds about women's capabilities, including my own. I've had the privilege of working alongside several female physicians, and I can attest that their skills are every bit the equal of their male colleagues." As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself drawn into conversation with Dr. Read about his work at Massachusetts General Hospital and his particular interest in treating patients regardless of their ability to pay. There was a passion in his voice when he spoke of medicine, a dedication to healing that reminded her of everything the Duke had lacked: genuine purpose, moral conviction, and a desire to make the world better rather than simply to advance his own position. "I should very much like to continue our conversation," Dr. Reed said as the evening drew to a close. "Perhaps you would allow me to call upon you at Mrs. Pembroke's. I believe you might find some of our local charitable organizations quite interesting." As Evangeline accepted his invitation, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine anticipation for the future. For the first time since that devastating morning at St. Thomas Church, she began to wonder if her humiliation might actually have been a blessing in disguise. What she didn't yet realize was that her greatest transformation was still to come, and that the man standing before her would play a crucial role in helping her discover who she was truly meant to be. 3 months had passed since Evangeline's arrival in Boston, and the transformation was remarkable. Under Agatha's gentle guidance and Dr. Reed's encouraging friendship, she had blossomed into a woman of purpose and conviction. Her days were filled with meaningful activities: volunteering at the Women's Clinic, attending lectures at Harvard's Extension program, and participating in the vibrant intellectual salon that Agatha hosted every Thursday evening. The pale, defeated young woman who had fled New York had been replaced by someone with genuine confidence and direction. Evangeline had discovered a passion for social reform, particularly in women's education and healthcare, and her natural intelligence, so long channeled into accomplishing the superficial graces expected of society, daughters now found worthy outlets. Dr. Elias Reed had become a constant presence in her life, calling regularly at the Beacon Hill townhouse and including her in his circle of reform-minded friends. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the calculated courtship rituals of New York society. He treated her as an intellectual equal, seeking her opinions on medical ethics and social policy with a sincerity that still surprised her. "You have remarkable insights into the challenges facing working women," he had told her, just the previous week as they walked through the common, the late January snow crunching beneath their feet. "Your proposal for a women's educational fund could genuinely change lives." It was during one of Agatha's Thursday salons that the letter arrived, an elegant cream envelope bearing the familiar Ashworth family crest. Evangeline's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper. "My dearest daughter," her mother had written, "I hope this letter finds you well and recovered from your recent trials. I write to inform you that the Astors are hosting their annual winter charity ball next month, and they have specifically requested your attendance. It seems your ... situation has generated considerable sympathy among our circle, and many are eager to welcome you back into society. Your father believes it would be beneficial for you to make a public appearance, to demonstrate that the Ashworth family remains strong despite recent challenges. The Duke and Cordelia will be in attendance as they are visiting from London, but I'm certain you are mature enough to handle such an encounter with grace." Evangeline set the letter aside with a mixture of emotions. The thought of returning to New York, of facing the whispers and curious stares, filled her with dread. But there was also something else, a growing sense that she was no longer the same woman who had been humiliated at the altar. She had found her own strength, her own purpose, and perhaps it was time to show the world who she had become. "Troubling news?" Dr. Reed asked gently. He had arrived for tea and noticed her distracted expression. "An invitation to return to New York," Evangeline replied, handing him the letter. "My mother believes it's time for me to face society again." Dr. Reed read the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful. "And how do you feel about that prospect?" "Terrified," Evangeline admitted with a rueful laugh, "but also curious. I'm not the same person who fled New York in disgrace. Perhaps it's time to show them who I've become. Agatha." who had been listening from her position by the fireplace, set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "Then you shall go," she declared. "But not as the defeated victim they expect to see. You'll go as the accomplished, independent woman you've become. And you won't go alone." The plan that emerged over the following days was both audacious and perfect. Agatha would accompany Evangeline to New York, ostensibly for a brief visit, but actually to provide moral support and witness her great-niece's triumphant return. Dr. Reed, who had been invited to present a paper on public health at a medical conference in New York, would also be in the city during the same week. "It's not about revenge," Agatha explained as they planned Evangeline's wardrobe for the trip. "It's about showing them, and yourself, that you've not only survived but thrived. You're no longer defined by what happened to you, but by what you've chosen to do with your life." The Astor Winter Charity Ball was held at their magnificent Fifth Avenue mansion, a palace of marble and gilt that rivaled anything in Europe. As Evangeline's carriage pulled up to the red-carpeted entrance, she felt her heart racing with nervous anticipation. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that Agatha had commissioned from Boston's finest dressmaker, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious. It perfectly reflected her new sense of self. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle of New York's elite, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across the assembled guests. Evangeline entered on Agatha's arm, her chin held high and her expression serene, though her pulse thundered in her ears. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused, fans fluttered, and heads turned to follow her progress across the marble floor. "Evangeline Ashworth," murmured Mrs. Astor herself, approaching with outstretched hands. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. Boston has clearly agreed with you." The next hour passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated encounters. Old friends approached with expressions of sympathy that barely concealed their curiosity, while former suitors who had once competed for her attention now seemed uncertain how to address her. Evangeline handled each interaction with grace and dignity, neither apologizing for her past nor dwelling on her humiliation. It was near the refreshment table that she finally encountered them, Cordelia and the Duke, now the Duchess of Pemberton, holding court near the elaborate ice sculpture. Cordelia wore a gown of pale pink silk that emphasized her delicate beauty, while the Duke stood beside her in perfectly tailored evening dress, every inch the aristocratic husband. But as Evangeline approached, she noticed details that others might miss. Cordelia's smile seemed forced, her laughter a bit too bright, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that powder couldn't quite conceal. The Duke, meanwhile, appeared restless and distracted, his gaze wandering around the ballroom with what looked like boredom. "Evangeline," Cordelia breathed, her face going pale as she spotted her sister. You look wonderful." "Thank you," Evangeline replied calmly. "Marriage seems to suit you, Cordelia. And your Grace," she added, turning to the Duke with perfect composure, "I trust you're finding New York society entertaining?" The Duke had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Miss Ashworth, forgive me, I should say Mrs. That is, double quotes, Miss Ashworth will suffice," Evangeline said smoothly. "I've chosen to remain unmarried for the present. I've discovered there are so many fascinating opportunities for an independent woman." Before either could respond, Dr. Reed appeared at her elbow, having just arrived from his medical conference. He was impeccably dressed in evening clothes that, while not as expensive as the Duke's, were worn with natural confidence and dignity. "Evangeline," he said warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting. Dr. Mackenzie asked me to convey her regards and to tell you that the women's clinic has received the funding you helped secure." "Dr. Reed," Evangeline said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure, "how wonderful that you could attend. Please, allow me to introduce my sister, the Duchess of Pemberton, and her husband, the Duke." The contrast between the two men was striking. Where the Duke represented polished aristocratic privilege, Dr. Reed embodied purposeful achievement. His conversation was intelligent and engaging, his manner respectful but not deferential. And when he looked at Evangeline, his admiration was clearly genuine rather than calculated. "Dr. Reed has been instrumental in establishing medical care for Boston's working poor," Evangeline explained, her voice warm with pride. "His dedication to healing, regardless of a patient's ability to pay, is truly inspiring." As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that Evangeline had found not just recovery but genuine happiness. She spoke passionately about her work with the women's clinic, her studies at Harvard, and her plans to establish a scholarship fund for young women seeking higher education. The defeated bride of 6 months ago had been replaced by a woman of purpose and conviction. The Duke, meanwhile, seemed increasingly agitated. His responses became shorter, his manner more brusque, and Evangeline noticed him glancing repeatedly at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Dr. Reed excused himself to speak with a colleague, the Duke seized the opportunity. "Miss Ashworth," he said urgently, "might I have a word in private?" Evangeline glanced at Cordelia, who was staring at her hands with obvious distress, then nodded coolly. Of course, Your Grace. They stepped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the mansion's winter garden, where gas lamps cast pools of golden light across the snow-covered paths. The Duke seemed to struggle with his words, his usual composure completely shattered. "I must speak plainly," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I made a terrible mistake, the greatest mistake of my life." Evangeline raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "Cordelia is... she's lovely, of course, but she's not... He ran a hand through his hair, destroying his perfect grooming. "She's not you, Evangeline. She lacks your intelligence, your depth, your strength. I was a fool to be swayed by momentary infatuation when I had the opportunity to marry a truly remarkable woman." "Your Grace," Evangeline said quietly, "you're speaking of your wife." "I know," he said desperately, "and that's what makes this so impossible. I'm trapped in a marriage to a woman I don't respect, while the woman I should have married has become everything I never knew I wanted." Evangeline studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the genuine anguish there. 6 months ago, his words would have meant everything to her. Now they felt like echoes from another lifetime. "You're quite right that it's impossible," she said finally, "but not for the reasons you think. You see, Your Grace, I've discovered something remarkable these past months. I don't need your approval or anyone else's to be complete. I've found my own purpose, my own happiness, and my own worth." The Duke stared at her, clearly not understanding. "But surely you must feel some satisfaction in knowing that I realized my error, that I would choose differently if I could." Evangeline smiled, and for the first time in their acquaintance it was a smile of genuine pity. "The only satisfaction I feel, Your Grace, is in knowing that your rejection led me to discover who I truly am. You did me the greatest favor of my life when you chose Cordelia at that altar." As she turned to leave, the Duke caught her arm. "Evangeline, please. Is there no chance?" "None whatsoever," she said firmly, gently removing his hand. "I suggest you focus on making your wife happy, Your Grace. She deserves better than a husband who wishes she were someone else." Returning to the ballroom, Evangeline found Dr. Reed waiting for her with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Everything is perfect," she replied, and meant it completely. "Shall we dance, Dr. Reed?" I find myself in a remarkably celebratory mood. As they moved onto the dance floor, Evangeline caught sight of Cordelia watching them with an expression of profound sadness. For a moment she felt a pang of sympathy for her sister, trapped in a marriage built on impulse rather than genuine compatibility. But then Dr. Reed's hand tightened gently on hers, and she focused on the present moment, and the man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, who supported her ambitions rather than trying to constrain them. The evening was far from over, and Evangeline Ashworth was just beginning to show New York society exactly who she had become. The remainder of the Astrobal passed in a whirlwind of congratulations and curious inquiries. Word of the Duke's obvious distress and Evangeline's composed rejection had spread through the ballroom, with the speed that only society gossip could achieve. By the evening's end, it was clear that the narrative had shifted entirely. Evangeline was no longer the pitied victim of a scandalous betrayal, but rather the dignified woman who had risen above her circumstances to find genuine purpose and happiness. "My dear," Mrs. Vanderbilt had whispered conspiratorially during the final waltz, "you've handled this entire situation with such grace. That young doctor seems absolutely devoted to you, and so accomplished. I do hope we'll be hearing happy news soon." Evangeline had smiled politely but said nothing, though she couldn't help but notice how Dr. Reed's presence had elevated her status in ways the Duke's title never could. Here was a man who had earned his position through merit and dedication, whose work actually improved lives rather than simply maintaining inherited privilege. The carriage ride back to the Ashworth mansion was quiet, with Agatha dozing against the velvet cushions and Evangeline lost in thought. The confrontation with the Duke had been both easier and more satisfying than she had anticipated. His desperate plea had only confirmed what she had already discovered, that she had outgrown not just him, but the entire world he represented. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Evangeline was taking breakfast in the morning room when the butler announced that Dr. Reed had called despite the early hour. She found him in the drawing room, pacing nervously before the fireplace, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Elias," she said, using his given name for the first time, "whatever is the matter? You look as though you haven't slept." He turned to face her, his gray eyes intense with emotion. "I haven't," he admitted. "Evangeline, I witnessed what happened last night. Not intentionally, but I saw you speaking with the Duke on the balcony. I couldn't help but overhear some of your conversation." Evangeline felt her cheeks warm. "I see. And what did you think of what you heard?" "I thought," he said, moving closer, "that you handled yourself with remarkable dignity and wisdom. But I also realized something that has kept me awake all night." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I realize that I cannot bear the thought of losing you to anyone, not to the Duke, not to New York society, not to anyone." Before Evangeline could respond, He dropped to one knee before her, pulling a simple but elegant ring from his waistcoat pocket. The diamond was modest by Fifth Avenue standards, but it caught the morning light with pure, brilliant fire. "Evangeline Ashworth," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, "I know I cannot offer you a title or vast wealth. I'm simply a doctor who believes that healing the sick and helping the poor is the highest calling a man can have. But I can offer you something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Evangeline stared down at him, her heart racing. 6 months ago, she would have been devastated by such a proposal. A simple doctor instead of a duke, a modest ring instead of family jewels, a life of purpose instead of privilege. Now she saw it for what it truly was, everything she had never known she wanted. "Elias," she said softly, kneeling to meet him at eye level, "are you certain you want to marry a woman who has been publicly humiliated, who comes with scandal attached to her name?" His answer was to cup her face gently in his hands. "I want to marry the woman who turned that humiliation into strength, who found her own purpose instead of accepting the one others chose for her. I want to marry the woman who volunteers at clinics, who fights for women's education, who sees beyond the surface to what really matters. I want to marry you, Evangeline, not despite your past, but because of how you've chosen to rise above it." "Then yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Evangeline felt a completeness she had never experienced before. This wasn't the calculated alliance her parents had arranged with the Duke, but a true meeting of minds and hearts. She was choosing her own future, her own happiness, her own definition of success. The announcement of their engagement created quite a stir in both Boston and New York society. The newspapers, which had once chronicled her humiliation, now celebrated her remarkable recovery and the love story that had emerged from scandal. From Duchess to Doctor's Wife, a modern love story, proclaimed the Boston Herald. While even the New York society pages admitted that Dr. Reed seemed a most worthy gentleman whose dedication to healing the poor speaks well of his character. The wedding preparations were a stark contrast to the elaborate spectacle that had been planned for her marriage to the Duke. Instead of St. Thomas's Church, with its 400 guests, Evangeline chose the intimate chapel at Harvard, with only family and close friends in attendance. Instead of an imported Worth gown, she wore a simple but elegant dress of ivory silk that Agatha had helped her select. Instead of orange blossoms and elaborate arrangements, she carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath that Dr. Reed had picked from Agatha's garden that morning. Her parents attended, though her father's initial disappointment at losing a ducal son-in-law had gradually given way to genuine respect for Dr. Reed's character and accomplishments. Her mother, ever practical, had been won over by the positive press coverage and the obvious happiness radiating from her eldest daughter. Cordelia did not attend. She had returned to London with the Duke immediately after the Astor Ball, and the brief note she sent was stilted and formal. "I wish you every happiness in your new life. Perhaps someday we can be sisters again." Evangeline felt a pang of sadness for the relationship that had been lost, but she refused to let it overshadow her joy. The ceremony itself was perfect in its simplicity. Dr. Reed's colleagues from the hospital served as groomsmen, while Dr. Sarah Mackenzie stood as Evangeline's matron of honor, a choice that raised eyebrows but perfectly reflected the new life she was choosing. When they exchanged vows, promising to support each other's work and dreams as well as to love and cherish, there wasn't a dry eye in the small congregation. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Evangeline said, her voice clear and strong, "to support your calling to heal and to pursue my own calling to serve. I choose you, Elias Reed, not because society expects it, but because my heart demands it." The reception was held at Agatha's townhouse, where the guests included not just family and society friends, but also the nurses and doctors from the clinic, the women from the literary society, and the working-class patients whose lives Dr. Reed had touched. It was a gathering that would have been unthinkable at a traditional society wedding, but it perfectly represented the new world Evangeline was entering. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Evangeline found herself alone with Agatha in the garden, the older woman's eyes bright with tears of joy. "You've become everything I hoped you could be," Agatha said, embracing her great niece warmly. "When you arrived here 6 months ago, you were a broken bird with clipped wings. Now look at you, soaring higher than you ever could have in that gilded cage." "I owe it all to you," Evangeline replied. "You showed me that there was another way to live, another way to find meaning and purpose." "Nonsense," Agatha laughed. "I simply provided the environment. The strength, the courage, the wisdom, all of that was already inside you, waiting to be discovered. That Duke did you the greatest favor of his life when he chose your sister. He freed you to become who you were always meant to be." As Evangeline prepared to leave for her honeymoon, a working trip to Chicago where she and Dr. Reed would study innovative approaches to public health, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once defined herself by others' expectations had discovered her own voice, her own purpose, her own power. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the catalyst for her greatest triumph. She was no longer Evangeline Ashworth, the railroad heiress who had been publicly humiliated at the altar. She was Dr. Evangeline Reed, social reformer, advocate for women's rights, and partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and purpose. And for the first time in her life, Evangeline was exactly where she belonged. 2 years had passed since that transformative autumn day when Evangeline's carefully planned life had crumbled at the altar of St. Thomas's Church. Now, as she stood in the bustling main hall of the Reed Women's Medical Clinic on Chicago's South Side, watching Dr. Sarah Mackenzie examine a young immigrant mother while her own husband consulted with a group of medical students, she marveled at how completely her world had changed. The clinic had been her vision, funded through a combination of her inheritance, donations from progressive Boston society, and Dr. Reed's tireless fundraising efforts. What had begun as a modest facility offering basic health care to working women had grown into a comprehensive center that provided medical care, health education, and even basic literacy classes. The building itself was a converted warehouse that Evangeline had personally overseen the renovation of, ensuring it was both functional and welcoming. The morning sun streamed through the large windows she had insisted on installing, casting warm light across the waiting area where women of all ages and backgrounds sat with their children. Irish immigrants fleeing poverty, German families seeking new opportunities, Italian mothers who spoke little English but understood the universal language of compassion, all found refuge and healing within these walls. Mrs. Reed called Margaret O'Sullivan, the clinic's head nurse, her Irish accent still thick despite 5 years in America. The delegation from the Women's Medical College has arrived for their tour. Evangeline smoothed her practical navy dress, a far cry from the elaborate gowns of her Fifth Avenue days, and moved to greet the visitors. She had discovered a talent for administration and fundraising that surprised everyone, including herself. Her society connections, once used solely for social advancement, now served a higher purpose as she convinced wealthy donors to support women's healthcare and education. "Welcome to the Reed Clinic," she said warmly to the group of female medical students and their professors. "I'm delighted to show you what we've accomplished here, and I hope you'll consider joining our mission when you complete your studies." The lead professor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, was a stern woman in her 50s who had fought countless battles to establish her position in the male-dominated medical field. "Mrs. Reed, we've heard remarkable things about your work here. The integration of medical care with education and social services is quite innovative." As Evangeline led the tour through the clinic's various departments, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work. In the examination rooms, she watched Dr. Mackenzie gently explain a treatment plan to a young mother in broken English supplemented with gestures and drawings. The small surgical suite, where Dr. Reed performed minor procedures that could save women from dangerous back alley alternatives, hummed with quiet efficiency. "This is our classroom," Evangeline explained, opening the door to a bright room where 20 women of various ages sat attentively as a nurse demonstrated proper hygiene techniques. "We offer classes in basic health, childcare, nutrition, and literacy. Many of our patients have never had access to formal education, and we've found that knowledge is often the best medicine." One of the medical students, a young woman named Catherine Mills, raised her hand. "How do you handle the language barriers? I notice patients speaking at least 4 different languages in the waiting room." "We've been fortunate to recruit staff who reflect our community," Evangeline replied. "Margaret speaks Irish, Gaelic, and English. Dr. Kowalski speaks Polish and German. And our newest nurse, Maria Santos, is fluent in Spanish and Italian. But more importantly, we've learned that compassion transcends language. A gentle touch, a patient smile, careful attention to someone's pain. These communicate more than words ever could." In the clinic's small library, shelves lined with medical texts donated by sympathetic physicians stood alongside children's books and basic readers for adult students. Evangeline had personally selected each volume, remembering her own hunger for knowledge that had been channeled into accomplishing superficial social graces before her transformation. "We believe that healing extends beyond treating immediate symptoms," she continued, addressing the group of future physicians. "Poverty, ignorance, and desperation are often the root causes of the conditions we treat. A woman who understands how to prevent infection, who can read medicine labels, who knows her rights, she becomes an advocate for her own health and that of her family." Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. "And your funding model?" This level of comprehensive care must be expensive to maintain. We operate on a sliding scale, Evangeline explained. Those who can't afford to pay do so, but no one has ever turned away for lack of funds. We've been blessed with generous donors who understand that investing in women's health strengthens entire communities. The husband often says that every dollar spent on prevention saves $10 in emergency treatment. As the tour concluded, Evangeline felt the familiar surge of pride in what they had built together. The clinic treated nearly 200 patients each month, had trained 15 women as nurses' assistants, and had seen a dramatic decrease in maternal mortality in the surrounding neighborhoods. In the afternoon, she retreated to her small office to review the clinic's financial reports and correspondence. The room was spartanly furnished but filled with meaningful objects. A photograph of the clinic's first graduating class of nurse trainees, letters of gratitude from patients, and a small vase that always held fresh flowers from her garden. Among the day's letters was one bearing a familiar London postmark, and her heart gave a small flutter of recognition. It was from Cordelia, the first communication she had received from her sister in over a year. The envelope was of the finest quality, bearing the Pemberton family crest, but something about the handwriting seemed less confident than she remembered. "Dearest Evangeline," the letter began in Cordelia's still familiar script, though the words seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there in their youth. "I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I have been following your work through the newspapers, the Chicago Tribune's article about your clinic was particularly inspiring, and I confess I wept with pride reading about your accomplishments. I wanted you to know how deeply proud I am of what you've built and how ashamed I remain of my role in the events that led you to this path. I must confess that my own life has not unfolded as I had hoped when I made that terrible choice at the altar. Chnuld and I, we struggle to find common ground in anything beyond the most superficial social obligations. He spends most of his time at his club or traveling to his estates, while I find myself increasingly isolated in London society. The other wives are polite but distant, and I suspect they view me as the American upstart who stole another woman's fiancé. Perhaps they're not wrong in their assessment. Our grand townhouse in Mayfair feels more like a beautiful prison than a home. I have everything I once thought I wanted: servants, jewels, invitations to the finest social events, yet I wake each morning feeling empty and purposeless. Reginald treats me with cool politeness, as one might treat a houseguest who has overstayed their welcome. I suspect he regrets his impulsive choice as much as I sometimes regret mine. I often think about that terrible day at the church and wonder if we were both victims of a momentary madness. What felt like overwhelming love at the time now seems more like infatuation, perhaps, or rebellion against the constraints of our upbringing. The passion that drove us to such desperate measures burned out within months, leaving us strangers sharing a name and little else. But I don't write merely to burden you with my troubles, dear sister. I write because I've been thinking about establishing a charitable foundation here in London, something to help young women from poor families receive education and training. I remember how you always spoke of wanting to make a difference in the world, and I wonder if you might advise me on how to begin such an endeavor. Perhaps some good can come from my position, even if my marriage has brought little personal happiness. I've been reading about the settlement house movement, about women like Jane Addams who are working to improve conditions for the poor. I have access to considerable funds and influential connections. Surely I could use these advantages to help others as you have done. Would you consider corresponding with me about such matters? I hunger for purpose the way I once hungered for romance. I hope that someday you might forgive me enough to correspond regularly. I miss my sister terribly, and I would give anything to have your guidance and friendship again. Please give my regards to Dr. Reed. The newspapers suggest he is as wonderful as he appeared that night at the Astor Ball, and I'm grateful that my betrayal led you to such happiness. With love, regret, and admiration, Cordelia Evangeline set the letter aside with mixed emotions. She felt genuine sadness for her sister's unhappiness, but also a profound sense of vindication that her own path had led to such fulfillment. The Duke's rejection, which had once seemed like the end of her world, had actually been the beginning of her real life. She walked to the window overlooking the clinic's small garden, where patients often sat with their children while waiting for appointments. An elderly Italian woman was teaching a group of young mothers how to identify medicinal herbs, her weathered hands gentle as she showed them which plants could soothe a colicky baby or ease the pain of childbirth. It was exactly the kind of informal education that made their clinic's special knowledge passed from generation to generation. Wisdom that couldn't be found in medical textbooks. That evening, as she and Elias walked home through the tree-lined streets of their modest but comfortable neighborhood, she shared Cordelia's letter with him. Their house was a far cry from the Ashworth mansion, a simple 2-story frame building with a wraparound porch and a full garden where Evangeline grew vegetables and herbs for the clinic's nutrition program. But it was filled with warmth and purpose in a way her childhood home had never been. "What will you tell her?" Elias asked, taking her hand as they paused beneath a street lamp. Even after 2 years of marriage, the simple gestures still sent warmth through her entire being. That I forgive her completely, Evangeline replied without hesitation. How can I not? Her betrayal led me to you, to this work, to a life I never could have imagined. I'll help her establish her foundation, and perhaps through that work, she'll find the purpose and fulfillment that her marriage has failed to provide. Elias smiled, the expression that still made her heart flutter after 2 years of marriage. You're remarkable, you know. Most women would harbor resentment for what she did. The woman I was 2 years ago might have, Evangeline admitted, but that woman was trapped in a cage of others' expectations, measuring her worth by society's approval. The woman I am now understands that happiness comes from within, from the work we do and the love we share. They paused at their front gates, and Evangeline looked back at the clinic in the distance, its windows still glowing with warm light as the evening shift cared for patients. Dr. Kowalski would be there until midnight, ensuring that women in labor had skilled care regardless of the hour. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, funding to secure, patients to treat, students to teach. But she faced it all with eager anticipation rather than duty or obligation. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the Duke hadn't chosen Cordelia? Elias asked quietly, his arms slipping around her waist. Evangeline considered the question seriously, as she had many times before. I would have become the Duchess of Pemberton, she said finally. I would have lived in a beautiful house, worn expensive gowns, and attended endless social functions. I might have been content in a limited way. I might have had children who would have been raised by nannies while I fulfilled my social obligations. But I never would have discovered who I truly am or what I'm capable of achieving. She turned to face her husband, her eyes bright with conviction. That Duke did me the greatest favor of his life when he humiliated me at that altar. He freed me from a life of beautiful emptiness and set me on a path to genuine purpose. I wouldn't trade our life, our work, our love, our partnership for all the titles and jewels in England. Inside their cozy home, the contrast with her former life was striking. Instead of formal drawing rooms filled with expensive furniture that no one was allowed to use, their parlor was comfortable and lived in, with medical journals scattered on the side tables and books on social reform stacked beside Ilias's favorite chair. The walls were decorated not with expensive paintings but with photographs of clinic patients, thank you letters from grateful families, and certificates recognizing their humanitarian work. As Evangeline prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the simple mirror above her dressing table. The woman looking back was different from the one who had once primped for society balls and worried about the perfect arrangement of her hair. This woman's hands showed the evidence of honest work, small scars from learning to assist in medical procedures, calluses from gardening and manual labor, ink stains from writing endless letters to potential donors. Her face bore the lines that came from genuine laughter and concern for others, and her eyes held a confidence that came from knowing her own worth. On her dressing table sat 2 photographs, one of her wedding to Elias, surrounded by friends and colleagues whose respect she had earned, and another of the clinic's first graduating class of nurse trainees. Beside them lay the simple gold band that marked her as Dr. Reed's wife and partner, a symbol infinitely more precious than the elaborate engagement ring the Duke had once offered. She picked up her pen and began drafting a response to Cordelia's letter. My dearest sister, she wrote, your letter moved me deeply, both for its honesty about your struggles and for your desire to find meaningful work. Of course I forgive you. Indeed, I thank you. Your choice that day, painful as it was, led me to discover my true calling and genuine happiness. I would be honored to help you establish your foundation. The work is challenging but deeply rewarding, and I believe you have the intelligence and compassion to make a real difference. Start small, perhaps with a single program or a small group of women. Listen to their needs rather than assuming you know what they require. Most importantly, be prepared to have your own assumptions challenged and your heart changed by the women you serve. I'm enclosing some materials about our clinic's programs and funding strategies. I'm also sending you the address of several London-based organizations that might serve as models or partners. Remember that the goal is not to rescue people, but to provide them with tools and opportunities to improve their own lives. Please write again soon. I've missed you more than I realized, and I'm eager to hear about your progress. Perhaps someday you might visit us here in Chicago. I think you would find the work as transformative as I have. With love and hope for your new beginning. Evangeline, as she settled into bed beside Elias, who was reading a medical journal by lamplight, Evangeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her reputation had instead become the foundation of her greatest achievements. She had learned that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from rising above it with grace and determination. I received a letter from Dr. Hartwell today, Elias mentioned, setting aside his journal. She wants to establish a formal partnership between our clinic and the Women's Medical College. They're proposing to send students here for practical training, and in return, we'd have access to their research and resources. That's wonderful, Evangeline replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. We could expand our educational programs, perhaps offer more advanced training for our nurses. And having medical students here would help us treat more patients. There's more, Elias continued, his voice carrying a note of excitement. She mentioned that there's growing interest in replicating our model in other cities. Boston, Philadelphia, even San Francisco have inquired about establishing similar clinics. Evangeline felt a thrill of possibility. We could develop a training program, help other communities establish their own clinics. Imagine the impact we could have: hundreds of women receiving care, thousands learning to advocate for their own health. I love you, Elias murmured, drawing her into his arms. I love your passion, your vision, your determination to change the world one patient at a time. And I love you, she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Thank you for seeing who I could become, even when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for being my partner in every sense of the word. Outside their window, the city hummed with life and possibility. In the distance, she could hear the whistle of a late train bringing new immigrants to Chicago, people seeking the same opportunities for reinvention that she had found. Tomorrow would bring new patients to heal, new students to teach, new battles to fight for women's rights and healthcare. But tonight, Evangeline read once Evangeline Ashworth, the humiliated bride, dressed in the arms of a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, surrounded by the life she had chosen for herself. She thought about Cordelia, alone in her grand London townhouse, and felt a surge of hope that her sister might find her own path to fulfillment. She thought about the Duke, trapped in a marriage built on impulse rather than genuine compatibility, and felt only pity for the emptiness of his existence. Most of all, she thought about the women who would come to their clinic tomorrow, the young mothers seeking care for their children, the elderly women finally receiving treatment for conditions they had suffered with for years, the girls learning to read and write for the first time. She had indeed bloomed where she was planted, but more importantly, she had learned to plant herself where she could truly flourish. The Duke's rejection had not been her ending, it had been her beginning. And what a magnificent beginning it had proven to be. In London, the Duke and Duchess of Pemberton lived in their grand townhouse, maintaining the facade of aristocratic perfection while privately regretting the choices that had brought them together. But in Chicago, Dr. and Mrs. Reed built something far more valuable than social status. They built a legacy of healing, education, and genuine love that would outlast any title or fortune. Evangeline had discovered the most important truth of all, that happiness could not be bestowed by others, but only claimed by those brave enough to define it for themselves. She had transformed from a woman who waited for life to happen to her into a woman who actively shaped her own destiny and the destinies of countless others. As sleep finally claimed her, Evangeline smiled at the thought of all the tomorrows stretching ahead, filled with purpose, partnership, and the profound satisfaction that came from a life well lived. The girl who had once measured her worth by others' approval had become a woman who created her own meaning, and in doing so had found everything she had never known she was looking for. What an incredible journey of transformation and triumph. Evangeline's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest setbacks become our most powerful comebacks. From the humiliation at the altar to building a life of purpose and genuine love, she proved that we have the power to rewrite our own stories. If this tale of resilience and self-discovery moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical dramas that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Like this video if you believe, like Evangeline, that true happiness comes from living authentically and pursuing meaningful work. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed like a devastating setback but actually led you to something better? What would you have done in Evangeline's situation? We'd love to hear your own stories of transformation and triumph. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of courage, love, and the extraordinary power of choosing your own destiny. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is not getting what we thought we wanted.